Hello and welcome to the
I
ninth,
watched in Russian.
my opinion, one of the Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Brussels Signal podcast. It is with great pleasure that I'm speaking with Professor David Betz of King's College London today. And I want to start with a general observation, which is, David, your main field of research is strategy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. I'm a professor in the Department of War Studies. My title is Professor of War in the Modern World. I'm a student of strategy, longtime student of strategy and war and warfare, and in particular, irregular warfare, insurgency, counterinsurgency, and the like. But I'm traditionally, I'm not a political scientist by in practice. I'm a student of war specifically.
I would say these days, not being a political scientist probably makes you all the more credible, given what's currently going on in the profession. Now, you made some waves in recent days with interviews with Louis Perry. Mark Stein commented on it. You wrote a very interesting paper on the issue of civil war. And interestingly enough, usually in the Western conversation, we talk about civil war. We think about Somalia. We think about Libya. We think about places that are far away and of which we know little. But you used the scientific literature and applied it particularly to the United Kingdom, but I would argue to the West on a more broader scale. And would you prefer to say that there seem to be signs that even within the supposedly stable Western societies, there is a certain risk of civil war, or would that be an exaggeration?
No, that's not an exaggeration at all. I would say my conservative assessment is that the risk of civil war in the West generally is well over 50%. I can explain why that is the case. That's a conservative estimate. I actually, personally speaking, I'm rather convinced that it is practically inevitable. But a more conservative estimate might say, look, the chances are 50-50. I can go through the details of that if you like and explain the essence of my argument.
Please, that'd be wonderful.
Well, it may take a few moments to go through because there are quite a lot of moving parts. So just forgive me if I go on for a bit. And I also apologize if your listeners are hearing a groaning noise. I have a very elderly dog sitting at my feet, and that's the cause of that. He refuses to move. So the essence of my argument is that the primary threat to the security and prosperity of the West today is not external but internal. And specifically, I believe that civil war is statistically highly likely to occur in one or more of at least a dozen countries, and thereafter to spread to others rapidly within the next 5 years. The result of this is likely to be a generalized state of violent civil disorder and accelerating economic decline. Its character at first is likely to look something like that of a Latin American-style dirty war, or for a European context, think of the Northern Ireland Troubles, for example. It's going to metastasize, however, primarily through attacks on urban infrastructure into larger conflicts by making large cities practically unlivable for normal people. A possibility ultimately is that the conflicts will evolve into an armed stasis between balkanized communities, in inverted commas, a very much more economically and culturally diminished patchwork of ethnic statelets in the place of what formerly were relatively coherent national political entities, i.e. what we now call countries. Equally, they might escalate to large-scale population movements like those seen in Central Europe at the end of the Second World War, or in India during the partition of the British Raj after the achievement of independence. In either event, what we're seeing overall can be described as signs of the birth of a new status quo based on the retribalization of Western societies. Fundamentally, Western societies today are explosively configured. They are, to use the cliche, powder kegs or ticking time bombs. awaiting the arrival of a spark. The essential problem here is multiculturalism. It's well over a decade since Angela Merkel and David Cameron both identified this problem as having led to the draining of social capital in society, the acceleration of political factional polarization in politics, heavily inflected by the introduction of identity politics as the norm in Western political discourse, as well as by the shattering by a generation of educational effort of the pre-existing pre-political loyalty of national populations. The steps that led to this were not accidental. They were rather deliberate. They occurred over a long period. They were often warned against very heavily and ignored. And they occurred largely in defiance of popular political wishes. That's why I feel the word failure as a description of this is something of a misnomer. It is, in fact, a huge accomplishment in social political terms. It took a lot of effort, determination, and skill for things to get this bad. So at this point, listeners often ask why I use the term civil war to describe what is likely to occur. After all, what I'm describing is essentially a popular reaction, in some senses a popular reaction against an elite-driven cultural project, in which case why not call it a revolt? This is a view that I'm sympathetic to, but as I can show later perhaps, or as I will show later, what is happening now has a lot of similarity to old-style peasant revolts. I use, though, the term civil war in the sense that it is most frequently employed in the academic literature, which is essentially value neutral, and it's a term used to describe a form of conflict in which two or more belligerents, there are two or more belligerents who were under the same sovereign authority when the war broke out. So there are qualities of the coming conflict which are of the nature of a popular revolt against an elite, but there are also qualities of it which are of the nature of an interethnic civil war. So to me, civil wars encompasses both of these categories. I don't mean to diminish the revolutionary qualities of what is happening, but just simply to use a term that encompasses both. A main problem is that these two vectors of conflict, if you want to call it, of internal conflict, if you are present at the same time, and they have the tendency to interact with each other. One sees this, for example, in the rhetoric that is very common amongst in anti-migrant quarters that says, look, not only are native populations being abused by burgeoning migrant populations and displaced in their own lands, but that is happening at the behest of a post-national elite, or at any rate in a situation in which the post-national elite seems to be ambivalent about what is happening. And that's why such charges tend to be invested with so frequently with these words of talk of elite betrayal, treason, and the like. I should probably also say a few words about I've used the word elite a few times. I should probably also be specific about what I mean when I say elites. This is another common question. In essence, I use the term in the sense that the American sociologist C. Wright Mills used it in his book, The Power Elite, which is a very old book now. It's 1950s, late 1950s, in which he defined the elite as essentially a triumvirate of political, military, and corporate or business figures, whom he described as power holders. Later scholars like Pierre Bourdieu and many, many others, it must be said, expanded this idea of power holders to include the media or other opinion formers more generally. Academics might also, and frequently are, included in this category of power of opinion formers or idea propagators. Another source of power that is now frequently talked about and usually referred to as the deep state is bureaucratic power, and it is regulatory in origin. In effect, the civil service has the potential to constitute a kind of power-holding elite of its own. This is one of the more corrosive things I would suggest to have happened in contemporary political life, because it tends to underpin the belief that voting doesn't matter. Because even if a reformer campaigns and wins an election, they can simply be obstructed in office. So nothing, in fact, changes. This, of course, is generally how the first Trump presidency is explained in conservative circles. In his book, Values and Virtues, the British scholar Matt Goodwin has a long discussion of the development of what he calls a new elite in British politics, which in his view is a fraction of the population, potentially up to a quarter of the population, which is university educated, which is urban in its living patterns, and particularly living in London, that is essentially liberal in its attitudes, that is highly internationalist in its outlook, globalist essentially in its outlook, and very comfortable about those things. Comfortable, at least up until recently, very comfortable with its situation. David Goodwin, or Goodhart rather, is another scholar important in this area. He described this elite fraction as the anywhere class. These are people who could effectively do well anywhere on the planet, and he placed those in conjunction with the somewhere class. These are people who are rooted in a particular place and depend upon the well-being of that place for their own individual life circumstances. There are other scholars that are important in this area. Peter Turchin in the United States has reached similar conclusions to me, I think is fair to say, about the coming civil war. He calls it political disintegration, but in effect, it is very much the same thing. He defines elite power holders in a way that encompasses money, most obviously. Wealth is power, but also coercive power, police, military, what have you, bureaucratic power, and soft power. So the problem, as Turchin sees it, is what he calls elite overproduction, which means basically a situation where there are too many people seeking elite status for the system to support elite extraction at the level of expectation. So the system can't manage the number of potential elites which it is producing, which is problematic because those want to be elites then turn those, let's see, call them surplus elites, become anti-status quo in their attitudes, which is a danger. So I tend to, when I use the word elite, I'm referring essentially to power holders and power as determined, and understand that power can be exerted through a number of means beyond the simply punitive or the financial. So now come back up to the Civil War and why I'm so.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'm gonna.
Because you touched on so much that in itself would be worthwhile. Each of these points would be worth a podcast in its own right. But it really resonated with what you just said, because the Austrian or Austro-American economist Joseph Schumpeter, he once wrote about that the end of capitalism will not come because communism or socialism is superior, but because capitalism is going to be so successful that it will produce an elite class that has, quote unquote, nothing meaningful to do. So what they're going to do is they will turn against the very system that enabled their existence in the first place. And it seems to me that that's a little bit also the argument that you are making, and also the authors that you are referring to. And as a quick other point, do you think it would be fair, and I mean this in all seriousness, to characterize the potential coming unrest or civil war almost a little bit like a zombie apocalypse, in the sense of that all the existing institutions, this is what you always see in the first 15 minutes of every zombie movie, right? The police is disintegrating, the military disappears. So all these institutions that we perceive as our civilization resting on, they break away. And then the only place you have to go, or the only people you potentially can rely on, is your family, right? Are these still hopefully existing communities? And that would then also dovetail with what you previously described as the retribalization of society. Because if you can no longer trust or rely on state institutions, your quote unquote tribe or your family is the only place you can go, isn't it?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that term, but I fundamentally I agree with that. I think it squares with my ideas here, which are in the larger sense that economically, politically, and socially, the West is in the end game of a certain of a was it simply in the end game as I can explain in some detail. But there are a range of theories for civil war causation. Right, so it's a subject that's been broadly studied for a long time, and of course, as scholars do, they tend to disagree over details, and there are lots of theories, and some are more strongly held than others, but they tend to overlap. And I think probably the most frequently cited one today, or at any rate the most recent one, is by the American scholar Barbara Walter, who was in the news a few years ago with her book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And she pointed the finger at three things particularly. Factionalism, which is probably most obviously evident in the rising of explicitly ethnic parties. But it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be ethnic, but in the current context, that is probably the most worrying sign, where people are essentially operating essentially on ethnic identity or sectarian identity, and being elected in their local areas. The other thing she points at is status loss by a formerly dominant majority. What in the academic literature is referred to as downgrading, but in popular discourse is usually referred to as displacement, or the Great Displacement theory. And thirdly, she points at the loss of, essentially the loss of faith, or the loss of hope. And specifically what she talks about is, or I think what she means is the loss of belief in the possibility of avenues of political change. What's happened is that the perceived functionality or the legitimacy of normal politics has collapsed. And one can see this, or one can measure this, I think, both directly through surveys, which, for example, which ask people to express their levels of confidence in political parties or the political system generally, which are pretty, to summarize, are pretty dreadful. Levels of trust in political institutions are extremely low and have been falling consistently year on year for 30 years. Or indirectly in measurements of social capital, which is essentially to a society. Think of social capital being something which is to the functioning of society in societal terms, as money is to functioning in financial terms.
Or like oil in a machine, right? It is the thing. It lubricates society in a way so that interactions can take place.
That's right. It's the thing that allows us to basically get things done on a societal level. It's slightly more complicated than that because it's generally thought that there are two major types of social capital that sound contradictory, or they do different things. There is uh, bridging social capital, which is basically like WD-40. It's like grease that allows us to interact um, smoothly across society. And if you've got lots and lots of bridging capital, then you can get lots and lots of people working kind of coherently, commonly towards a given agenda. Then there's also bonding capital. Bonding capital is like a super glue, basically. And that's what allows, essentially, bonding capital is all about in-group trust. And both are important. Both are aspects of social capital. Anyway, all of the things that Barbara Walter points to as being important in terms of Civil War causation are very starkly evident across at least a dozen Western states. I've picked out, just on the basis of high-level political pronouncements of the potential of civil conflict, emerging at least 15 countries where credible high-level political figures have said this over the last 5 years. But it's very obvious in all of the most important of the Western states, including the United States, and for somewhat different reasons, Britain, France, and Germany. So, and at root, near most of this is a reaction to mass migration. Another frequently invoked cause of civil conflict is elite overreach, which can be defined as a situation in which elites are seen to have sought to change the rules of the game societally against the wishes and the perceived interests of most of the population. Elite overreach tends to lead to conservative or peasant uprisings. I'm not using the word peasant disparagingly here. It's literally a description of empirical historical fact. So if you look at late medieval and early modern peasant revolts in England, for example, these were guided by tradition, by custom, against which elites were perceived to have given offense, and were attempts, vainly as it turned out, to restore a lost world, more than they were to create a new world. So it doesn't take a genius really to perceive elite overreach as being a core aspect of contemporary social and political life throughout the Western world. Another important issue is expectation gap, which relates to elite overreach, and that's an idea that refers to a situation where people perceive a difference between what they believe they have been promised and what they actually receive. Most often, this is discussed in the context of material well-being.
Can I intersect real quick? And just to connect 2 points, because I think you spoke very eloquently about the issue of elites, and I'm always wrestling a little bit with this issue. And there's I don't know if you're a movie buff or if you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, but there is one scene when I think it's when Maximus returns from the front, and there are like these two senators in the audience. And one senator says to the other one, I don't know what the trigger of the conversation was. He says, "I never took you as a man of the people." And then the senator said, I'm not of the people, but I'm for the people. And I think what this was supposed to mean is that you can be part of the elite, but you can still be part of an elite that has the interest of the people, including precisely in the way that you just mentioned, also that has also the interests of the peasants at heart. And I'm wondering, do you think it would be a fair characterization, if we want to flesh out a little bit the contemporary elites, that they differ to some extent from previous elites, that I might be slightly exaggerating here, but that they have almost a certain, that they recoil when they think of the people. There's almost a kind of disparaging attitude towards the people, right? It's the rebel rousers, that they're hoi polloi, so that not one should not be too nostalgic about it. But the idea that in the Victorian age, right, you had those elites, but the idea was that Victorian values should permeate all of society, and ultimately even somebody from the working class should show gentlemanly behavior. but now there's almost a certain pride within the new elite that they are different from the people, that they, in a sense, I would almost argue, despise the people. I think you see this in the German-speaking parts of the world more so probably than in other parts, where there is this argument that migration is a good thing because more or less our own people are not up to the standards that we think they should be. Or do you think that's an exaggeration? But I'm really wondering, when did it happen that there is such a strong sentiment, exactly what you just described, and so many of the policies the elite seem to stand for are so contrary to the interests or the well-being of a majority of the population? What do you think, what drives them? I know you're not a psychologist, neither am I, but I always wonder, do you think it was the shock of World War One? Is it as Pascal Bruckner, the French philosopher, said, is it a tyranny of guilt after World War II and the Holocaust? Or do you have any theory what could be the driving force behind that elite behavior? Or do you just take it, for granted, it is what it is, and we have to deal with it, and historians in the future have to ask the question as to why it happened the way it did?
Well, in all honesty, I'm not so grand or clever to make a big argument about um, the causes of this. So I couldn't have written The Tyranny of Guilt, for example, let alone even more popular works like Douglas Murray's Strange Death of the West, for example. Um, uh,
But I think that makes your argument so strong.
Occidentalism, Roma's Occidentalism. There are many works in this vein, often very philosophical in perspective. I'm not such a person. But I am fairly empirical um, uh, in my assessment of things. So, I talk about the condition of the elite essentially as an observation as an empirical observation of fact and attitudes. I can, if you wish, add my perspective on
Yes,
why it
please.
has happened, and I'll come to that in a second. But a few things before I do so that I think are relevant is it's important to understand that that revolutions do tend to. One of the things, even about bottom-up revolutions, is they require an elite. So you get elites and counter elites. So you have to get almost always. You need to have some kind of leadership, and that leadership arises usually within the elite. I think in Turchin's terms, it would tend to arise within that fraction of the elite, which is surplus, which is kind of frustrated elite that hasn't made it in, or for reasons of for whatever reasons of their own. You have a fraction of the elite which also decides that they also think that the system is invidious and requires a kind of root and branch change in a very fundamental way. So even when you have an anti-elite revolution, it's got elites involved in it. We can call this a paradox or just something weird, but it is simply a matter of fact. About our current elite, what distinguishes them from examples such as you've given from the Gladiator film, or the French elite on the verge of the the French Revolution, not the Napoleonic Revolution. I think what distinguishes our current elite is not its attitudes of disdain or contempt for the hoi polloi. It has those attitudes, but I don't think that makes them different from the past. I think the main difference is our elite is post-national in its orientation. They are people who have not been. They're not. They have been educated, and are educated in the tradition of post-nationalism. They don't have real concept of national interest. And in fact, they find the words national interest to be kind of suspicious. When people talk about national interest, or they say, Germany for Germans, France for French people, Britain first, these are for our current elite very difficult ideas. People expressing them are highly suspicious, rather disreputable people, which is weird if you think about it. Like, what is controversial about the idea that Germany is for Germans? There is. It's only controversial from the perspective of a political class or of an elite class that simply doesn't believe in national identity in the way that it once did, and in which a certain fraction of the normal population still does. So we have this very strange situation where we have national governments with national leaders who are not really interested in national politics. A really great example of this was an interview with Keir Starmer prior to his election, when he was asked when his relative view on he was asked to decide between Davos or Westminster. And he said, well, Davos, of course. Davos is where, things get decided. People are having, working on big problems online. And whereas Westminster is just this tribal shouting place. Okay, so that idea, it's not nakedly contemptuous of Britain. You have to read the subtext to understand that he holds much of the population in contempt, or at the very least, he's completely ambivalent about it. But I think that contempt is probably probably a reasonable the way I would put it, for what it's worth. So the main difference is the elite is post-national in its orientation. When did this happen? You mentioned a few points. I think it's been a long process. And I am, as you might guess, for a war studies professor, fairly impressed by the idea that really the turning point was the First World War. It was the First World War because what you see after the First World War is you get these social antenna, by which I mean artists, poets, and the like, people who are essentially who essentially work as antenna. They pick up kind of ideas in the broader society, and they articulate them on paper in the form of music or poetry or visual art of one sort or another. They're not necessarily making elaborate arguments, or even arguments which are conscious. They're doing this. They can be doing this very unconsciously. So you look at the poetry which comes out after the First World War. You get things like Yeats' The Second Coming, which is a literally apocalyptic poem. He's writing it because he's writing it in the wake of the First World War, which had 18 million dead. He's in the midst of the influenza crisis that would kill 19, 20 million people extra, and it just so happens also that his wife's got the flu and is pregnant, and he sees the world just coming apart. But what he's detecting, or T.S. Eliot, most famous poem, the Wasteland. What is the wasteland? It's in a nutshell, it's an expression of an idea surrounding essentially the death of the modern project. The modern project in the sense of the creation of utopia on Earth through rational scientific means. We were supposed to get a paradise
version of history,
right? So we were supposed to get a paradise created by man's deliberate labor, and instead what we got was the slaying of a significant fracture of European youth, the destruction of its historic empires. And followed 20 years later by the Holocaust, and the dropping of the atomic bomb, which, if which just made the message that already the likes of Yeats and T.S. Eliot were picking up a generation before all the more obvious. By the time we get to our period, right, so, you don't need to be as perceptive as early 20th century poets to detect the uh, the kind of civilizational ill health. It's very, very obvious. But I would, to be even more specific and rather less philosophical, as I said, I'm not really a philosopher, but I think that education has a lot to answer for. Our educational systems were very deliberately, across the Western world, were very deliberately shifted from essentially being designed to produce, to create productive national citizens who had a national sense of themselves, had inculcated in them a set of ideals and beliefs, myths, fair to call it, about their society in order to become productive members of that society. We largely abandoned that. In fact, subverted much or inverted much of that. So, and that occurred. Certainly my education, so I'm almost 60 years old. So, that happened a long time ago. We're already. So, in answer to your question, that's where I would, as far as I could go. The major difference is the post-national attitudes of our elite and the way that has emerged over a lengthy period, going back at least a century, but accelerating in recent.
You mentioned that you're not a philosopher, but I think that is what exactly gives so much weight to the argument. You're very sober-minded, empirical in your approach to this. You're not a fire-breathing pundit or a rebel-rouser. So you approach this issue as sober-minded as possible. And what I find so remarkable is, I think if we would have had this very conversation 10 years ago, or maybe 15 years ago, people would have said, you're nuts, right? I mean, how can you even think along these lines? But I think exactly what you described is, there's a serious prospect of whether you want to call it civil war, civil unrest, whatever it is, breaking out at whatever point in time. If you would, and that's, predictions are always very difficult, especially regarding the future. But you mentioned a couple of countries that you looked at. If you would, and you don't have to, if it makes you feel uncomfortable. But which countries, if we say it's like a train ride, and that the final destination is a civil war-like situation, which countries do you feel are the longest ahead in that ride, or what would you sense that the powder keg is potentially closest to meet the spark that would make it all blow up?
Okay. No, I'm happy to. Thanks for your comments, firstly, but I'm happy to speak directly to that question, and I simply ask your listeners to accept that this is an opinion. It's an informed opinion, but at the end of the day, I'm speculating on where things are going. And I have to say, as you said at the beginning of this discussion, this isn't the first time that I've said this. I've written some papers. People have read them. I've spoken to other people. People have listened to that. And a lot of the correspondence I've had in reply may be summarized by people saying, essentially, well, no, duh. This is obvious. I knew this was happening. I sensed this was happening. I said this 20 years ago. I said, there are lots of people, who observed this, and I'm not congratulating myself on my perspicacity for having observed something which plenty of other people have recognized. If I'm doing anything, I'm just doing what scholars often do, which is articulated in a somewhat more formal and systematic manner. So if that's working for you and convincing, I'm glad, but I'm not pretending that what I've concluded here is something um, revelatory that lots of other people have not recognized or felt. And one of the reasons actually why this does seem so important right now is that there are so many people coming out and saying, well, I feel this. I feel this in my, in my gut, essentially. Okay. But to answer your question, I have to maybe be a little bit systematic again and complete my thought around civil wars and the way they are caused. And I was speaking before that last interjection about expectation gaps. Most often, these are discussed in the context of material well-being, right? It's a very deeply held idea in Western culture, which says that children are more prosperous than their parents. This has been the case for an idea which has dominated Western thinking for at least 100 years, and in some cases going back further than that, right back to essentially Industrial Revolution. You might take it as far back as that. In actuality, though, if you look now, children are less well off than their parents in nearly every respect. They earn less at the same age. They have fewer savings. They have less expectation of pension and Social Security in their own old age. They find it very much harder to get on the property ladder. They also find it very much harder to get enough wealth and security to procreate. So they're not having families. And even more surprisingly, their health is diminishing. They're less healthy at the same age than were their parents, and they're predicted to die younger. This is, in other words, a gigantic gap in expectation of really great significance if you think of that idea of children doing better materially than their parents as essentially foundational to the whole Western identity or project. You can expand the concept of expectation gap to include other variables. However, for instance, there is, or rather there was, an expectation that voting mattered because politicians regarded elections as signals of voter demand on policy issues that they would act upon accordingly. Nowadays, though, the most common political belief across essentially the breadth of the Western world is that isn't left or right in ideological terms. It is that voting doesn't matter. The most commonly expressed political belief in the Western world today is that voting doesn't matter. Why? And that voting doesn't matter because it doesn't change things. So people, become ambivalent or apathetic or frustrated by that situation, and effectively, in political terms, they drop out. The fact of the matter is, as research has shown very conclusively, that's true. It doesn't matter. When there is a contradiction between elite wants and popular attitudes, elites always get their way, always. This has been shown very conclusively in a very convincing piece of research done on American politics. My supposition here is that this is firstly demoralizing, very obviously, and secondly exceedingly dangerous because it means that the single largest source of potential political energy in the system or in society is latent in the form of a large group of people who are convinced that the system is invidiously corrupt. And they're just waiting for someone to convince them that they can change it. however many eggs may be broken in the process. So the bottom line is that there are a number of huge and growing expectation gaps in Western society, and if there is one thing the literature is agreed upon, it's that expectation gaps are dangerous. To this, we need to add a couple of other elements. What I've described thus far, from the beginning of the discussion to just now, is what the American political scientist Sheldon Wolin described as managed democracy, or as he sometimes put it, inverted totalitarianism. The term, ironically, has often been used to describe post-Soviet Russian politics under the Yeltsin and particularly in the Putin era. And I say that ironically because it is just as, if not more opposite, a description of the West, which in fact was what Sheldon Wolin was talking about when he wrote his book on managed democracy. He was talking about American politics. A superb example of, and essentially managed democracy can be defined as a system of democracy where elections are performative. They don't change things fundamentally. They're there to essentially to be performed. A superb example of this recently is the threatened jailing of Marine Le Pen in France, which is a classic managed democracy or guided democracy tactic. When you've run out of ideas, run out of arguments, and you're fearful of the rise of a potentially genuinely anti-status quo actor coming to power through the established mechanism of politics, and you don't have any way of resisting that, then you use the power of the state, specifically the legal system, to force them off the table. In short, then, to answer your question, to come to an answer of your question of where specifically and when, you have to understand that we're at the limits of the techniques of managed democracy to continue to manage politics in the Western world, in large part because of digital connectivity, which, all things being equal, actually makes it harder for governments to lie and to manufacture consent, as Noam Chomsky very famously put it in his book on the interrelationship of political and media power holders, a book written 45 years ago, I think. So I don't mean to suggest that governments are not still trying to use managed democracy methods, only that their efforts to do so are increasingly obvious to everyone and increasingly counterproductive. Suffice to say, in a nutshell, the old methods of control, of political and societal control, are failing. At the same time, we are also nearing the end of the Western model of economic financialization, which is in the process of collapsing under the weight of debt, which I think most people, most objective people now consider to be very unlikely to be paid back. The upshot of this is that the use of welfare and other forms of public spending, which heretofore have served as means to dampen social tensions, essentially by paying off individuals and communities with public funds from, in order to, as a kind of social soporific, is also faltering in its effectiveness, because the money is running out, and at some point it will simply collapse totally. Then there is the matter of external pressure. Now, I started off our discussion by saying the threats are mainly internal and external. I don't mean to say that there are no externalities which are not important. And so I'll mention essentially, I'll mention one of them, which is over the coming year or two, we are going to see the effect of a catastrophic defeat of the West in Ukraine, um, which is occurring at huge economic and geostrategic cost. The economic cost is increasingly obvious now, with Trump rather frantically trying to recoup some of the potentially hundreds of billions that have been poured into the war. Um, uh, um, but the effect of defeat in its proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, the West is going to see probably the collapse of transatlanticism as its guiding kind of foreign policy, central principle of foreign policy, not least as a result of the United States also turning inward and towards its own region as its fortunes also diminish. Let's not forget that the United States now is also a very heavily indebted country. Russia and China are now joined in a Eurasian compact of significant economic and military depth. Neither of them, for reasons of their own, are likely to see any reason to want to help out the West in its time of troubles. So even if they don't actively involve themselves, which they might do, but even if they don't, they're certainly not going to see much reason to intervene for our benefit. Okay. So if you take all of those causes together, you can see, in other words, there are a range of causes that scholars talk about as contributing towards the possibility of civil war, and they're not just, and the current conditions in the West don't just satisfy some of them or many of them partially, but effectively all of them extremely well. And that's what I'm urging, other scholars, really, certainly policymakers, to understand, that this isn't a phenomenon which is peculiar to black and brown people in faraway, dusty places. There's no reason why, and many reasons. There is no reason why not, and many reasons why we will see a reoccurrence of this in our own countries. The chances, which brings me to a bit of the maths part of this. The book by Barbara Walter, which I mentioned earlier, is important here because she concludes, on the basis of her research, that in any given year where the conditions of civil war are present, the chances of it breaking out are 4%. So that may make you feel very comfortable to say, well, look, 4% isn't very much. That means there's a 96% chance that it's not going to happen. The problem is, if you think of the probability over 5 years, right? If you think of probability over 5 years, given a 4% as your baseline, then the chances are 18%. You might think, well, that still means that's an 82% chance of not occurring. David, why are you so why do you seem so convinced that this is likely to occur, given the balance of probability? Well, here, though, you have to assume, as I've said, that there are at least 10 countries where these conditions are present. So at least 10 countries which are in the frame for this to occur. So if you think of the probability, given 10 countries, of it occurring in one place over 5 years, you get to about 87%. Now you have to assume, as essentially everyone does, that we live in a connected world, And in fact, one of the qualities of civil wars is they tend to radiate. They tend to you tend to see civil wars occurring in places that happen to neighbor places where civil war is occurring. So let's just assume arbitrarily but plausibly that there's a 50% chance of transmission, where when you have country A goes into civil war, there's a 50% chance that country B, which also has those conditions, also experiences that thing. So now if you run the numbers with those assumptions, 4% annually, 10 countries in your frame of analysis, 5-year prospect, 50% chance of transferring from one country to another, you get to a number that's you get to 60% as the chance that should civil war break out in any one of those places, that it will propagate to all of the others. Okay, even if you're not mathematical, 60% is a big number. Now, and that's based on what is I think actually a pretty optimistic assessment of the potentiality. That's starting with 4%. And as I've said, the conditions in the West aren't just those that Walter points to as important. There are many more others. So maybe it's 6%, maybe it's 8%. On the other hand, maybe I'm just too pessimistic. I'm just old, disagreeable. Maybe it's only 2%. In which case, just run those numbers again and tell me how confident you are. I'll leave it up to your listeners to do so. But you even at 2% potential over 5 years in an interconnected social system, international system, you get to some pretty significant and worrying probabilities. Now, to name names, I'm often asked, well, where is it going to happen first, David? And I've up until recently, I had thought probably the United States. I think that the Trump's election kind of was a bit of a pressure valve, but I suspect over the next 4 years we'll see that just build up again, probably because of the difficulties of actually reforming anything within a settled imperial system like that, which the United States has evolved into. But at any rate, I think that the United States is probably not the most immediate at present. I think Britain has leapt to the front since last summer, specifically with the Southport attacks and the reaction to that, and then the overreaction of the government to the potentiality of wide-scale rioting. And that situation is simply, the government has been, I think, reasonably effective in scaring people into a degree of silence, but they're simply waiting for the next group of toddlers to get chopped up, or the next Ariana Grande concert to get exploded with a nail bomb or something like that. Yeah, who knows what it'll be, but something will be along probably within, given the timing, probably given the previous frequency of these, quite possibly over the coming summer. But France is a very strong contender, and the recent headlines out of France, I think, are quite alarming, in the sense that they seem to just very deliberately, it seems, reinforce the idea that there's no normal political way out of this. you can't vote your way out of the situation, which will just increase the chances that anti-status quo actors skip up right over the normal politics. Um, um, I know less about Germany than both of the preceding cases, but I think that the mood music in Germany is not dissimilar from those. So I would say if this was an Olympic race for the world's most disgraceful um, uh, finish line, you would have, Britain and France tied with the United States somewhere behind, and Germany um, also in the running.
It appears almost that because we talked about the West in general, but do you have any specific take on Central and Eastern Europe? Because for all the trouble that they're having and for everything also we hear in the media is that, countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, of course, as well. They seem, for all the issues they have, and no country is perfect, but the likelihood of civil war in these countries seems to be significantly less for many of the issues that you mentioned, right? Whether it's migration, whether it's the decline of social capital. I mean, I'm sure it's not as good as it was at other times in history, but it's probably not as bad as it is in France or the United Kingdom or other places in the West.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Central and Eastern Europe are less obviously in this frame, and the reasons for that are exactly as you've described. So the issues with respect to migration, multiculturalism, and the like are less severe in these countries because it they've participated less in this process for reasons that are completely obvious. And I think much of the time when Central and Eastern European leaders talk about the prospect of this, they're usually actually saying, "Look, we don't. What we're saying is we don't want to take in, you know, uh, 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 huge volumes of unassimilable migrants because we fear what will happen is exactly what is happening in countries in the likes of the countries that I've just mentioned." So I think in that sense, the pronouncements of East and Central European leaders about this is I think it's more prophylactic in its character. They're saying this is what might happen should we allow um, um, things to develop as our Western friends have allowed to develop. Secondarily, though, I think, and perhaps a little bit more philosophically, or at any rate, if we look back at it from a longer perspective, the East and Central European countries kind of exited the modern project for a period of 50 years. So that in a sense, they were, because while they were under a system of Soviet vassalization, which had many deleterious effects on their society, economically and socially, no doubt. But one of the beneficial effects, I think, is that they are um, probably pretty heavily inoculated against elite overreach. They're highly and so for a complex of reasons that I think most listeners will grasp, the potential is less in East and Central European countries than it is in others. But they only need to look at Sweden, for example, about which exactly the same things might have been said 10 years ago, but which now is a country that is in extreme disorder.
And you could say that in cities like Malmö, I mean, those are already quasi civil war like.
Malmo is functionally well. It's a here I might talk a bit about how I think this, go into a bit more detail about the character of these civil wars might be. And the key thing, I think, is, or another key idea here, is the idea of a feral city. Feral city is an idea that was first propagated again within military circles. It was based on it was an idea of an American defense analyst named Richard Norton, who was writing in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings, so for a military audience. And he was saying, look, he was trying to say to the American defense establishment that it had to get its head round the idea that wars of the future would be dominated by the problems created by what he called feral cities. And a feral city is one, as he defined it, as a big city, I think 10 million people. But anyway, a big city that is essentially functionally, that simultaneously manages somehow to function within the larger kind of global system while being almost complete, to varying degrees, ungoverned or malgoverned. Yeah. So there are a bunch of factors that he looked at to describe, functionally describe a feral city. Things like crumbling infrastructure, inability to, crumbling infrastructure is one, public bankruptcy, so bankruptcy of the local government is another very strong indicator. No-go zones for police, or what are sometimes another way of describing no-go zone is the popular term, but essentially what it means is an area of a nominally sovereign authority where there is a negotiated level of control. So the police might be able to go in and arrest someone, but they're not going to roll in and arrest just anyone. They're going to have a discussion with the community leader. Yeah. Before they take action, they will think carefully about the potential reaction on a mass scale of the community in which they're operating. So if you look across these range of measures, as Norton does, he says, look, there are green, amber, and red. Red is completely feral. Amber is lots of warning signals. And green is a normally functioning society. When he wrote that paper in 2003, his best example of a feral city was Mogadishu, Somalia. But if you look at the categories that he's and the examples he's given of important factors, that applies to plenty of places in the West today. Most major, certainly it applies to Malmo, where no-go areas are very obvious. Certainly applies to Birmingham today, which is essentially an increasingly third world city, which is extremely poorly governed. By poorly, I mean functionally bankrupt, unable to perform basic public services, like, for example, picking up the rubbish. So it's literally a filthy, rat-infested city at present, with a third world health system, but is also actually pretty corrupt in the way it operates. There was an example a few months ago where a British politician, who happened to be a Birmingham politician, but she's a member of parliament, talked about going into hospital in Birmingham and being sort of advanced to the front of the queue on account of her status. Well, that's what I mean by a third world functioning health system. That's not our expectation of how a health system works, but it is how things work in chronically malgoverned and corrupt places. No-go areas, pretty obvious, right? Which is why almost a year after some local boys beat up some police in the Manchester airport, they have not been arrested and charged. One could give 100 thousands of examples of this. But suffice to say that there are plenty of these cities which are increasingly amber in their on a scale of virality, which means they're very unstable, they're very tenuous, and they're often perceived by the indigenous population or people of the titular nationality as effectively being occupied, which is why, if you look at anti-status quo discourse in Britain, for example, so much of it is concerned with the loss of London and the perception that this is that it has simply become a non-British city. So I think what is going to happen is at first we will see sort of attacks on public figures, judges, potentially politicians, though politicians are relatively highly guarded and also not perceived as particularly influential relative to other figures. But so we'll see, increasing numbers of direct attacks. Imagine Northern Ireland scale, or Northern Ireland in intensity, but on a completely national scale. So if you just scale up, the worst year in Northern Ireland was 1971, when there were about 500 deaths. If you just scale up that to the whole of the UK at a population of about 70 million, you get to about 23,000 deaths a year on a just kind of Northern Ireland scale, which is a pretty big number. But it won't. I think the problem there is that once it gets to that scale, it will likely increase because there won't be a coherent British army kind of holding things together. So then it will metastasize, and specifically it'll metastasize through infrastructural attacks, is my strong assumption based on the readings of anti-status quo figures, both on the left and on the right. They both sides seem to understand and have understood now for a long time, at least back to the 1990s. That the way to accelerate societal collapse is not to attack directly police or other figures or any other, but to attack indirectly. So you hit the electrical power grid, the communications grid, the transportation networks, the gas distribution network, all of which are effectively soft targets that are located outside of the cities, so they're relatively accessible, but the attack of which can have very significant multiplicative effect. You can imagine, for example. And so I usually suggest people imagine a scenario like the 2011 London riots, which occurred over about a week, and on any given night during the riots, there were maybe a few thousand people on the street. Of those, maybe 200 or 300 were seriously hardcore, violent. But that almost completely overwhelmed the police. So imagine a scenario like the 2011 London riots, but 10 or 20 times larger. So, like we're talking about 2,000-3,000 hardcore violent people on the street. And it's happening every 2 weeks throughout the whole of the winter, during which time the transportation system is not working, so people are not working, so food and goods, don't come into the country or don't come into the city. The city is unable to move waste out, so that it just becomes literally filthier and more violent. The power doesn't work. The power, because people are knocking over the electrical pylons on the outside. So half the time you don't have power. You're sitting in the dark while people are trashing the city. You're probably cold because you're in an apartment that's heated electrically. Or maybe you're in a home that's heated by gas, but the gas grid doesn't work because someone's blown up the gas compression station, of which there aren't that many, and they are basically big bombs in their natural state. So you're cold, you're hungry, you're jobless, and you're frightened because it's pandemonium outside. What are you going to do? Well, that's a good question. Your listeners can answer what they might do individually. I'm not really talking about individuals. I'm not a prepper. My research is not on that level, but you can imagine that the situation is one that is not conducive to clear and reasonable thinking about the political direction of the country, and can in no way be described as normal civil life. Probably most people are going to do the obvious thing, which is to get out of the cities. And that too is a problem in these terms, because people don't, the way people flee, population movements tend to have an assortative function. So you'll have, people are signaling their affiliation by when and to where they flee. And once they have fled, once you've been displaced, it's much easier. Once a population has been displaced, it's much easier to recruit them to do abnormal things, to use violence specifically, because they have a specific grievance, and they have now, because they've lost their homes, their jobs, their homes, and the like, they have lowered opportunity costs to direct violence. So that's why, one of the most frequently invoked metaphors when we talk about civil war or any kind of issue like this is the idea of the tipping point, right? Tipping point. You push a rock at the top of the hill and it goes down, and as it goes down, it gets faster and faster and does more and more damage. And you can see why, when you think through in detail the processes that I'm describing, that once you pass that tipping point, it's bad news, and the bad news creates more bad news, and the effects, it becomes very, very difficult. Which then maybe, if you're not completely exhausted, raises the question of whether we're past the tipping point already. Which I suspect we are.
Do you think we are?
Yes, I do. I think we are. I think when the histories of now are written from a distance of some decades, I think we'll look back and say, actually, the tipping point by which understand that is the point after which there's not much that can be done to prevent it. That's in the past already.
Well, I would say on this uplifting note, Professor Betz, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to having you on again in the future.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I hope that was interesting, but certainly
very much so.